If you take a walk through the historical core of Nicosia or Lefkosia, depending on where you're standing, right? Lefkosia on the Greek Cypriot side, Lefkosia on the Turkish Cypriot side. It's Europe's last divided capital. And the atmosphere, it just shifts in an instant.
It really does. 1 minute, you're, surrounded by all the sights and smells of a lively Mediterranean city.
Yeah, cafes, shops.
Exactly. And then the next, you're suddenly facing a wall, or maybe just a line of barrels, sandbags, stretching off into this complete silence.
Patrolled by the UN. It's uncanny.
It is. That's the edge of the green line.
And that quiet tension, that really strange, jarring contrast between, bustling life and this silent UN-patrolled military zone.
Yeah.
Well, that's really the central dilemma of Cyprus, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an island with this incredibly deep, layered history, but it's anchored really firmly to this sharp, modern division.
So today, we want to trace that story for you. We're going to try and unpack not just if Cyprus can unite, because that's the big question everyone asks, but we really need to understand why this division, which, started decades ago, has become so entrenched, so deep.
And crucially, how the only plausible path forward might actually be achieved. We'll be drawing on, everything from history right up to the latest diplomatic moves as in October 2025.
Okay, so let's get into this history, but maybe first we should probably touch on a few essential terms, because you read about Cyprus and you bump into this very specific language all the time.
Absolutely, yeah. Good idea. So first up, the Green Line. That's the UN buffer zone. It runs about 180 kilometers across the island, basically separating the Greek Cypriot-controlled south from the Turkish Cypriot-controlled north.
And it's not like a solid wall everywhere, right?
Not at all. It varies hugely. Sometimes it's just a few meters wide, like in Nicosia. Other times it's several kilometers across. It's more of a zone than a line.
Okay. Then there's UNFICYP.
Right. That's the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus. They've actually been there since 1964.
Wow, since 64.
Yeah, making it one of the longest-running UN peacekeeping missions ever. It's quite something.
And the guarantor powers. That term comes up a lot.
It does. That's Greece, Turkey, and the UK. Under the 1960 agreements that set up the Republic, they retained the right to intervene.
Intervene to uphold the settlement.
Correct.
Yeah.
To uphold the state of affairs created by the treaties, this whole external security structure is, it's absolutely crucial to understanding why the original Republic basically failed.
Got it. And the political goal, the thing everyone talks about in negotiations.
That's the Bizonal Bicommunal Federation, or BBF for short. It's the internationally endorsed plan. The idea is 2 constituent states, 1 Greek Cypriot, 1 Turkish Cypriot.
But under one federal roof.
Exactly. 1 single sovereignty, 1 international personality. That's the blueprint.
Okay. And finally, Varosha, or Marash.
Varosha. Or Morash, yes, in Turkish. That's probably the most painful, visible symbol of the division. It's the sealed-off resort quarter of Famagusta or Gazimatusa.
A ghost town, essentially.
Pretty much. A ghost city, frozen in time since 1974. And it's a constant, very raw reminder of all the unresolved property claims and the human cost.
Okay, that gives us the key terms. So let's dive into the history. Where does the story really begin? Copper. Empires.
It really starts deep, deep in the past. Think late Bronze Age. The island was known as Cyprus.
Cyprus, like Kypros.
Exactly. And that name, Cyprus, it's almost certainly where the word copper comes from, or maybe the island's name itself. Copper was everything.
So the island was valuable from the very beginning because of its resources.
Hugely valuable. Copper trade centered there in cities like Enkomi. This anchored Cyprus into these vast trading networks across the whole Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah.
It's what first put it on the map as, a vital strategic place.
But it wasn't just about metals and trade, was it? There's a very strong cultural element from early on. Greek culture.
Oh, definitely. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, so well before classical Greece even, you see this solidifying Mycenaean Greek cultural presence.
So Greek communities were there very early.
Yes, and they consolidated their identity over centuries. It wasn't like one big invasion. It was more gradual through migration, trade, integration. By the 11th century BCE, that identity was really embedded.
And that sets the stage for, everything that follows. A Greek-speaking Christian majority.
That's the bedrock, yes. That deep cultural foundation persists right through. And then, like you said, empires just start layering on top.
Right, layer after layer.
Exactly. For literally millennia, Cyprus was basically a part of somebody else's empire. You had Assyrian influence, Persian control. It became a Roman province in 58 BCE.
Then Byzantine.
And Byzantine rule from the 4th century CE. And what's really fascinating is that through all these shifts, Cyprus somehow holds on to its Greek-speaking Christian character.
So constantly connected to bigger powers, but keeping its own identity.
Precisely. Its location meant it was always strategically important, so external powers always wanted it, but its core identity remained quite stable.
Okay, moving forward, medieval period. Crusaders.
That's the man. Yep. You had the Lusignans, the Frankish dynasty, then the Venetians, the big maritime power. But the really crucial turning point, the one that directly shapes the communities we see later, is the Ottoman conquest.
1571. That sounds like a major event.
It was huge. It followed a really long, brutal campaign. The siege of Famagusta Gazimatusa is legendary, very bloody. But the Ottoman arrival fundamentally reshaped how the island's society was structured.
How so? What changed?
Well, under the Venetians, the Orthodox Church, the Greek Cypriot Church, had often been kind of suppressed in favor of Catholicism. The Ottomans brought in their millet system.
The millet system.
What did that do?
It basically recognized different religious communities' millets and gave them a degree of internal autonomy. So the Orthodox Church actually gained power and status compared to under Venice.
So wait, the Ottoman conquest actually strengthened the Orthodox Church's position in some ways. Paradoxically, yes. It improved conditions for Orthodox Christians relative to Venetian rule. But at the same time, it introduced a permanent, politically distinct Turkish Muslim community to the island. Land grants were given to soldiers, and settlers came from Anatolia.
So it solidified the Greek Orthodox community structure while also adding this second major community. That's a really interesting dynamic.
It's the core irony, really. And for centuries after that, from 1571 right up until, say, the late 19th century, Greek and Turkish Cypriots lived together, coexisted.
Was it peaceful coexistence?
Our analysis, looking at that long stretch, emphasizes coexistence. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't tensions. Of course there were, like in any multi-religious society under imperial rule. But it wasn't the sharp political ethnic conflict we see later.
So what changed? What hardened those lines?
Nationalism, specifically the ideas of modern nationalism imported essentially with the arrival of the British.
Britain, 1878. They take administrative control under the Cyprus Convention. Why then?
Pure geopolitics. It was a strategic move against Tsarist Russia's expansion towards the Mediterranean. Cyprus became a key asset.
A forward base.
Exactly. A forward bastion protecting the sea lanes to the Suez Canal and, crucially, to British India. That strategic value never went away.
Which explains why they held on to it, annexing it in 1914 during World War I.
Precisely. And why, even when they granted independence later, they insisted on keeping those sovereign base areas, Akrotiri and Dekilia. Cyprus was always seen as this unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Eastern Med.
So the British arrive, focused on strategy, but their administration had unintended consequences internally.
Absolutely. Here's where that divergence really accelerates. The British system of governance, while maybe efficient in some ways, it basically codified the separation between the communities.
How did it do that?
They formalized separate representation, separate electoral roles, separate municipalities in some cases, separate educational systems. This translated existing religious and cultural identities into fixed political categories.
And these categories started looking outwards to Greece and Turkey.
Increasingly, yes. Instead of fostering a unified Cypriot identity, the structures encouraged both communities to align with the nationalist narratives emerging from their respective motherlands.
Which leads directly to the two big conflicting aspirations.
Right. You get the Greek Cypriot movement for Enosis union, with Greece becoming dominant in that community. And as a reaction, you get the Turkish Cypriot counter-movement for Taksim partition of the island.
And by the 1950s, these weren't just political ideas anymore.
No, they had armed wings. You had EOK, the guerrilla group fighting for Enosis, launching attacks against the British and sometimes Turkish Cypriots. And then TMT, the Turkish resistance organization, formed to counter EOK and push for Taksim.
So the British were caught in the middle of these two escalating nationalisms.
Completely trapped, trying to manage this anti-colonial struggle that was simultaneously an intercommunal conflict, all under the growing shadow of the Cold War. It was an impossible situation.
Which leads us out of the colonial era, but into, well, perhaps an even more difficult period, independence.
Indeed. The colonial struggle didn't end with a clear victory for anyone. It ended with a compromise. A very complex, very fragile compromise. The Zurich-London Agreements of 1959 and 1960.
And these agreements created the independent Republic of Cyprus in 1960, designed to stop both Enosis and Taksim.
That was the explicit goal, prevent both extremes, but the state they created, well, like you said, it was flawed, fatally flawed, perhaps, from the very beginning. It was built on mutual suspicion and veto powers.
Tell us about that structure. It sounds complicated.
It was incredibly complicated. You had a Greek Cypriot president, Archbishop Makarios, and a Turkish Cypriot vice president, Fazıl Küçük, who held veto power over key areas like foreign policy, defense, security legislation.
A veto, so one person could block major decisions.
Effectively, yes, on crucial issues. And then there were fixed quotas in all state institutions. Turkish Cypriots, who were about 18% of the population, were guaranteed 30% of public service jobs, and critically, 40% of the army.
40%? That seems disproportionate. What was the thinking there?
The thinking was security guarantees. It was meant to ensure the Turkish Cypriot community couldn't be marginalized or open-bound. But in practice, combined with the veto,
It led to gridlock.
exactly. It wasn't designed for smooth governance or majority rule. It was designed to prevent domination, but the consequence was that it incentivized obstruction and political brinkmanship from both sides.
And on top of this internal complexity, you had the external layer, those guarantor powers.
Right. Greece, Turkey, and the UK. Retaining the right to intervene, jointly or even unilaterally in some interpretations, to restore the state of affairs established by the treaties.
So the island's security wasn't really in its own hands.
Not fundamentally, it was externalized. And given that Greece and Turkey had directly opposing agendas for Cyprus, Enosis versus Taksim, this guarantee system just poured fuel on the fire of internal mistrust. It made resolving problems domestically almost impossible.
So this complex, brittle structure, how long did it actually last?
Not long at all. The cracks appeared very quickly. By late 1963, things were already at a breaking point.
What happened in '63?
President Makarios proposed 13 amendments to the Constitution. He argued they were needed to make the government workable, to remove the blockages caused by the vetoes, and recalibrate representation slightly.
How did the Turkish Cypriot side see that?
They saw it as a fundamental attack, as an attempt to strip away their guaranteed rights, nullify the partnership state created in 1960, and basically open the door to Enosis. The trust completely evaporated.
And the result was violence, the bloody Christmas of 1963.
Yes, terrible intercommunal clashes erupted in December. Hundreds died on both sides. The bicommunal government totally collapsed. Turkish Cypriot ministers and officials withdrew.
And this is where the physical separation really starts.
Critically, yes. What happened next is often overlooked, but it's key. About a quarter of the entire Turkish Cypriot population, maybe 25,000 people, were displaced. They moved into fortified enclaves for safety.
Enclaves, so pockets of territory.
Yes, protected by Turkish Cypriot fighters. This led to the de facto creation of separate administrative structures within those enclaves. So the physical separation, the beginnings of partition on the ground, started right there in late 63, early 64, way before 1974.
That's a really important point. The pattern of segregation was set early, and with the government collapsed and fighting ongoing.
There were real fears of a full-blown war between Greece and Turkey, the guarantors. That's when the UN Security Council stepped in.
And authorized UNFICYP.
March 4th, 1964. UNFICYP arrived. Their initial mandate was to prevent further fighting and help restore normal conditions.
The normal never really came back, did it?
No. Instead, UNFICYP's presence, while preventing wider war, kind of froze the situation. It inadvertently helped solidify the physical separation on the ground and establish this pattern of international peacekeeping managing rather than resolving the conflict. And they're still there today.
So an unstable status quo persisted for another decade, but the underlying tensions never went away.
Not at all. They festered. Nationalist pressures continued both on the island, with groups like EOKB still pushing for Enosis, and critically, from the military junta that had taken power in Athens in 1967.
The Athens junta. They played a direct role in what happened next.
A decisive role. They were impatient with Makarios, seeing him as an obstacle to achieving Enosis. So on July 15th, 1974, they backed a coup d'etat against him.
A coup against the president of Cyprus orchestrated from Greece.
Yes, led by Greek officers and the Cypriot National Guard. They installed Nikos Samson, a former EOK fighter and a hardline supporter of union with Greece.
Makarios escaped, but Samson was in power. How did Turkey react?
5 days later, on July 20th, 1974, Turkey launched a military operation. And this is where the language gets incredibly silent and contested.
Right, intervention versus invasion.
Exactly. Turkey invoked its rights under the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee. It framed its action as a peace operation, an intervention necessary to protect the Turkish Cypriot community, prevent Enosis, and restore the constitutional order that had been overthrown by the coup.
And the other side's view.
The Republic of Cyprus, and the international community largely, termed it an invasion. They argued Turkey's actions went far beyond any rights granted by the treaty, especially the second phase of the operation, and violated Cyprus's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So two completely different narratives for the same event. But the military reality was stark.
Undeniable. The Turkish forces landed, first securing a corridor linking Kyrenia or Ghanay on the north coast down towards Nicosia, Lefkosia. There was a brief ceasefire. Talks in Geneva failed.
And then phase two?
Then came the second offensive in mid-August. Turkish forces expanded their control significantly, eventually stopping along the line that exists today, controlling about 36–37% of the island's territory in the north.
The human cost of this must have been catastrophic.
Immense. It resulted in a massive sudden wave of displacement, effectively partitioning the island along ethnic lines almost overnight. We're talking estimates of around 160,000 Greek Cypriots fleeing or being expelled from the north to the south.
And Turkish Cypriots moving the other way.
And around 60,000 Turkish Cypriots, moving from the south up to the north, seeking safety in the Turkish-controlled area. This mass displacement created these incredibly deep, painful, intergenerational wounds over lost homes, lost property, and, tragically, missing persons.
The missing persons issue. That's still unresolved for many families today.
It is. The ceasefire line where the fighting stopped became the UN buffer zone. The green line we talked about, manned by UNFICYP, it solidified the de facto partition that remains the reality.
But amidst all that tragedy and politics, you mentioned something. A human element that cuts through it.
Yes, the Committee on Missing Persons, the CMP. It was established in 1981, a bicommunal body supported by the UN. Its job is purely humanitarian, to locate, excavate, identify, and return the remains of those who disappeared during the troubles of the 60s and 1974.
So Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot scientists working together.
Working side by side. Imagine, decades later, painstakingly digging in fields, identifying remains through DNA. They've given answers to over 1,000 families, Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot. It's incredibly difficult, sensitive work, but it represents this core of shared humanity, this refusal to let politics erase the basic need for closure. It's a powerful thing to witness.
A small bridge across that divide. So 1974 leaves the island physically divided. What happens next politically in the north?
Well, the Turkish Cypriot leadership first declared a Turkish federated state of Cyprus in 1975, essentially proposing a federal structure, but that wasn't recognized internationally except by Turkey.
And then they went further.
Then, 8 years later, on November 15th, 1983, they declared full independence as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, the TRNC.
How did the world react to that?
Immediate and near-universal condemnation. The UN Security Council acted very swiftly. Resolutions 541 and 550 were passed, declaring the TRNC's declaration legally invalid.
Legally invalid? What does that mean in practice?
It meant the UN affirmed the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of Cyprus over the whole island. It called on all countries not to recognize the TRNC, and to this day, only Turkey recognizes it.
So this unilateral declaration essentially locked the North into international isolation.
Completely. Dependent politically, economically, and militarily on Turkey. This non-recognition status became, and remains, a fundamental obstacle to any settlement.
Now, you mentioned earlier this creates a kind of legal paradox, especially with European courts.
Yes, it's fascinating legally. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has consistently held Turkey responsible for human rights violations in northern Cyprus because it exercises effective control there.
Okay, so it holds Turkey responsible.
But at the same time, in cases dealing with property claims by displaced Greek Cypriots like the Big Demopolis case, the ECHR has also accepted the Immovable Property Commission, or IPC, which was set up by the TRNC authorities as a valid domestic remedy.
Wait, so the court doesn't recognize the TRNC government, but it does recognize a legal body created by that government for settling property claims. How does that square?
It's legal pragmatism, essentially. The court recognized that demanding full restitution, everyone getting their original property back after decades, would involve mass evictions of current Turkish Cypriot occupants and create huge new injustices.
Disproportionate new wrongs, I think, was the phrase used.
Exactly. So the IPC, which offers options like restitution in some cases, compensation, or exchange of property, was deemed an acceptable mechanism to provide a remedy, even though the ECHR doesn't recognize the entity that established it. It's a way to deal with the practical problem without changing the political stance on recognition.
A very complex legal balancing act. Meanwhile, on the political track, what was the main goal of negotiations?
The lodestar, the guiding principle agreed by both sides early on, was that Bizonal Bicommunal Federation, the BBF.
When was that agreed?
In the high-level agreements between the leaders in 1977 and 1979, they set the framework. A federal Cyprus with two constituent states enjoying political equality, but within a single country with a single international legal personality and single sovereignty. That's been the basis for UN and EU efforts ever since.
Which brings us to probably the most famous attempt to actually implement that. The Annan Plan.
Ah, yes, the Annan Plan of 2004, named after the then UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan. It was arguably the most comprehensive, detailed blueprint for reunification ever put forward.
And it went to referendums.
Simultaneous referendums, yes, on April 24, 2004. This was just days before Cyprus was due to join the European Union. The timing was crucial.
And the result?
A dramatic split. Turkish Cypriots voted yes, approving the plan by a significant margin, 65%, but Greek Cypriots rejected it overwhelmingly. 76% voted no.
Wow, such a stark difference. Why did the Greek Cypriots reject it so strongly? It was based on the BBF framework they'd agreed to.
The reasons were complex. Officially cited concerns included security, particularly the continued presence of Turkish troops, even if reduced, and the guarantee rights. There were also issues with the property arrangements, how many refugees could return, and a general feeling that the proposed federal structure wasn't functional or sustainable, that it didn't adequately address the consequences of 1974. Fundamentally, there wasn't enough trust or perceived security for the yes vote to win.
And the immediate consequence of that vote
was that Cyprus joined the EU a week later, on May 1, 2004, as a divided island. The Republic of Cyprus joined, representing the whole island legally.
But EU law.
The Acquis Communautaire, the body of EU law, was suspended in the north under Protocol 10 of the Accession Treaty, pending a settlement.
So the South got full EU membership benefits. The North remained outside the EU system. That must have changed the dynamics.
Hugely. It created this asymmetry. The Republic of Cyprus now had the political and economic weight of the EU behind it, while the North remained isolated, further complicating the search for common ground based on political equality.
Did talks continue after that major setback?
Yes, there were further rounds. Actually, significant momentum built up again between 2015 and 2017. The leaders at the time, Nikos Anastasiades for the Greek Cypriots and Mustafa Akıncı for the Turkish Cypriots, developed a good working relationship.
What did they achieve?
They made real progress, closed substantial gaps on many chapters, including territory. They got very close on the map, apparently down to only about a 1% difference in the territory each side would administer under a federation.
That sounds promising. So what went wrong? It all collapsed at Crans-Montana in Switzerland in 2017.
It did. And the sticking point, yet again, boiled down to security and guarantees, specifically the presence of Turkish troops, the timeline for their withdrawal, and the future of the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee. Turkey wasn't willing to give up intervention rights entirely, and the Greek Cypriots wouldn't accept any continuation of them. That was the rock it perished on.
The same fundamental issue that bedeviled the Annan Plan.
Pretty much. And since Crans-Montana collapsed in 2017, positions have noticeably hardened, especially in the north. The rhetoric shifted away from BBF towards demanding sovereign equality and exploring a two-state solution.
Which the Republic of Cyprus and the international community reject.
Categorically. They remain firmly committed to the BBF framework as the only acceptable basis for a settlement. So we're kind of in this diplomatic impasse again.
And during this impasse, we've seen moves on the ground, particularly concerning Varosha Marash.
Yes, the ghost city. It had been fenced off and untouched since 1974 under UN Security Council resolutions that basically said it should be returned to its original Greek Cypriot inhabitants, possibly under UN administration as a confidence-building measure.
But that hasn't happened. Instead,
starting in 2020, Turkish and Turkish Cypriot authorities began unilaterally opening parts of it. First the beachfront, then some streets.
Why is that so controversial? It sounds like opening it up might be a good thing.
It's controversial because it's seen as changing the status quo unilaterally, outside the agreed UN framework. It's perceived by the Greek Cypriot side and the UN as an attempt to create new facts on the ground, potentially putting Varosha under Turkish Cypriot control permanently, which complicates future negotiations, especially around property, and directly contradicts those Security Council resolutions. It drew a lot of international criticism.
So another move that hardens positions rather than building bridges. But you mentioned bridges earlier, the crossing points.
Ah, yes. Amidst all the high-level deadlock, the opening of the crossing points across the Green Line back in 2003 was genuinely transformative for ordinary people.
Before 2003, you just couldn't cross.
Pretty much impossible for most Cypriots. And suddenly, in April 2003, the Turkish Cypriot side opened the checkpoints. It was hugely emotional. You hear stories from shopkeepers, maybe near the Ladra Street crossing in Nicosia, recalling that first day.
What was it like?
Just overwhelming. Seeing neighbors, friends, sometimes even family members they hadn't seen for 30 years, literally walking across a line that had seemed impenetrable. Thousands crossed in those first few days.
And it's continued since then. People cross regularly.
Absolutely. It's normalized now. Thousands cross every day for work, shopping, family visits. You have students from the north commuting to universities in the south. It hasn't solved the political problem, of course, but it created this essential human connection, this minimal peace dividend. It showed that coexistence is possible, practical even.
A reminder of what's possible. And is there any current diplomatic effort to try and restart talks?
Well, the UN hasn't given up. In January 2024, the Secretary General appointed a personal envoy, Maria Angela Holguin Cuellar from Colombia.
Broad her role.
Her mandate is to explore whether there's enough common ground between the two sides to even resume formal negotiations. She's been shuttling back and forth, meeting everyone.
Any signs of progress?
It's very cautious optimism at best. The fundamental positions, BBF versus sovereign equality, remain far apart. So as of October 2025, there's an envoy trying to find a way forward, but no actual negotiation process has been relaunched. The stalemate largely continues.
Yeah, so that brings us pretty much up to the present-day situation. Let's look at the island as it is now and what the future might hold. The buffer zone is still there.
Still there. That 180-kilometer stretch, varying in width, cutting right through the capital, Nicosia, Lefkosia. UNFICYP is still patrolling it, monitoring the ceasefire lines, mediating local disputes over farming or construction near the line. Their mandate was just renewed again until January 31st, 2026.
The fact they still need renewing after 60 years says a lot.
It highlights the fragility, yes. The status quo isn't static. It requires constant management to prevent incidents.
But beneath that, you mentioned the bicommunal work continues, like the CMP for missing persons.
Yes, the CMP is vital. And there are other initiatives, too, in areas like archaeology, cultural heritage preservation, environmental projects, civil society dialogues. These are often small-scale, but they keep communication channels open and demonstrate that cooperation is possible when focused on shared human concerns, away from the zero-sum politics.
Now, something that's dramatically raised the stakes in recent years is energy, right? The gas discoveries offshore.
Oh, massively. Huge natural gas fields discovered in the eastern Mediterranean within Cyprus's claimed exclusive economic zone, or EEZ.
And the Republic of Cyprus wants to develop these.
Absolutely. They see it as crucial for their economic future. They're working with neighboring countries, Greece, Israel, Egypt, exploring options like pipelines, potentially the EastMed pipeline project, or exporting gas via LNG terminals in Egypt.
But Turkey has a very different view.
Completely different. Turkey doesn't recognize the Republic of Cyprus's EEZ agreements with other countries. It argues that Turkish Cypriots must have a say and receive a direct share of any revenue from resources found around the island. And Turkey also has its own extensive maritime claims in the region, which overlap with Cyprus's and Greece's.
So you have competing claims, competing development plans. It sounds like a recipe for tension.
It has been. We've seen naval standoffs, disputes over drilling rights. Energy has become this huge, complicating factor. It's a potential source of massive wealth, but also a major driver of geopolitical friction.
Could it also be a catalyst for a solution? Shared resources, shared benefits?
That's the hope. Some proposals involve putting energy revenues into an escrow account to be shared after a settlement, or establishing joint development zones. If they could agree on how to manage and share the energy wealth, it could provide a powerful economic incentive for reunification. But equally, if they can't agree, it could just deepen the division and increase the risk of conflict. It really is a double-edged sword.
A major geopolitical factor. And speaking of geopolitics, we have to mention the British sovereign base areas, the SBAs. Akrotiri and Dhekelia.
Right. The UK retained full sovereignty over these two areas, about 3% of the island's landmass, under the 1960 independence treaties. They weren't leased. They are British sovereign territory.
And they're still actively used.
Very actively. They're crucial military and intelligence gathering hubs for the UK and its allies, particularly the US. They provide a strategic foothold in a very volatile region.
So any future settlement for Cyprus has to accommodate these bases. They're not going anywhere.
Exactly. Any comprehensive security arrangement for a reunited Cyprus needs to figure out how these sovereign British bases fit within the new federal structure. It adds another layer of complexity to the security puzzle.
How might that work? Replacing the old guarantor system seems key.
Absolutely. The 1960 guarantee system is widely seen as defunct and destabilizing. The discussion now revolves around finding alternative security arrangements, maybe involving the EU.
In the EU role.
Perhaps. Some ideas involve an EU security support mission, not necessarily military, maybe focused on policing, monitoring implementation, providing reassurance to both communities that could help facilitate a phased withdrawal of Greek and Turkish troops and replace the outdated interventionist rights of the guarantors. But again, that's complex territory.
Let's touch on the economic realities again. Huge disparity between North and South.
Significant disparity. The South, the Republic of Cyprus, is an EU member state with a relatively high-income, service-based economy, tourism, financial services, shipping. It's integrated into the global system.
And the North.
The North, because of the non-recognition and the EU aqua suspension, is much more isolated. Its economy is smaller, heavily reliant on tourism from Turkey, agriculture, the public sector funded largely by Ankara, and thousands of Turkish Cypriots crossing south to work. There's a big income gap.
So a settlement would presumably bring major economic benefits, especially for the North.
Potentially enormous benefits for both sides, but especially transformative for the North. Think about it. Harmonized regulations across the island, integrated infrastructure and logistics, huge synergies in tourism, access to the EU single market for the North, plus potentially billions in EU structural funds to help convergence. The economic peace dividend is arguably one of the strongest arguments for reunification.
Okay, so we've covered the history, the conflicts, the failed attempts, the current situation, the big complicating factors like energy and security. Let's try to synthesize. Why, after all this time, does the division persist? Can we boil it down?
I think we can try. We could maybe think of it as 5 key vetoes or blockages that have kept the island divided.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the fundamentally flawed constitutional design of 1960. Those absolute vetoes, the complex quotas, the external guarantor rights, it was built for deadlock, not cooperation. Second, those competing national projects. Enosis on one side, Taksim on the other. These weren't just political ideas. They fueled militancy, suspicion, and ultimately violence, making a shared Cypriot identity impossible to forge at the time.
Third blockage.
Third, the deep trauma of 1963-64 and especially 1974. The violence, the mass displacement, the missing persons list created profound intergenerational fear and mistrust and entrenched the physical and psychological separation. Losing your home leaves a very deep scar.
Number 4.
The legal and political framework that resulted, specifically the international non-recognition of the TRNC. While upholding international law, it also locks the Turkish Cypriot community into isolation and makes their political identity claims revolve almost entirely around achieving recognition or sovereign equality, hardening negotiating positions.
And the 5th veto, something newer.
Yes, the more recent geopolitical layers. Things like the discovery of offshore energy resources, which has brought in new regional rivalries and interests, and also issues like migration control across the Green Line. These add new complexities and give external actors more leverage, sometimes making the status quo seem preferable to the risks of a settlement.
Okay, those 5 vetoes paint a pretty clear picture of the challenges. So, given all that, what's the actual path forward? You said the BBF is the only internationally recognized one.
That's right. The Bizonal Bicommunal Federation remains the only game in town, internationally speaking. Any other path, like formal partition or a two-state solution, simply won't get international recognition or EU acceptance.
But for a BBF to work this time, it needs to be designed differently from 1960.
Right.
To avoid those pitfalls.
Absolutely crucial. It needs to be functional. Political equality is essential, yes, but it can't mean paralysis. So you need carefully designed governance mechanisms, perhaps a rotating presidency between the two communities, a bicameral legislature with balanced representation, maybe effective deadlock-breaking mechanisms in a federal constitutional court. The details are critical to ensure it can actually govern.
And what about the alternatives people talk about? Confederation. 2 states.
Well, confederation, or a formal two-state solution, faces categorical rejection from the Republic of Cyprus, from the EU, and from the UN Security Council based on existing parameters. It's currently seen as a non-starter internationally, however much it might be discussed rhetorically in the North.
So realistically, it seems the most plausible route, however difficult, is back to BBF talks.
It seems so. Trying to build on the convergences that were achieved before, particularly up to Crans-Montana, focusing on the core issues: security arrangements that make both sides feel safe without external interference, fair and practical property solutions based on the ECHR framework, and those functional governance structures.
And sequencing seems key. Maybe tackling property and security first.
Possibly. And critically, any deal needs to be underwritten by tangible benefits. That peace dividend has to be real and visible from day one. That means clear frameworks for sharing energy revenue and significant financial support, likely from the EU, to help the economies integrate and modernize. Without that economic incentive, it's much harder to sell the political compromises needed.
So wrapping up, we started with that walk along the dividing line in Nicosia. Where does that leave us?
Well, if we go back to those crossing points, Later Street, Journea, what you see every single day is quiet human interaction. People crossing, trading, visiting family. In a way, the island is constantly redrawing its own map through this daily movement.
A quieter story than the headlines about talks collapsing.
Exactly. It's a story of resilience, of practical coexistence. It shows there's a foundation of shared life there, often overshadowed by the high politics and the barbed wire. But it's a foundation that leaders, if they choose, could still build upon.
The division, as we've seen, is the result of centuries of history, competing ambitions, external interference, a complex web.
It truly is. But its resolution, ultimately, requires political will and courage. The courage for both sides to accept interdependence, to find ways to safeguard their identity and security within a shared federal structure, not outside it, and the courage to design a system based on equality that is also functional, that doesn't just repeat the mistakes of the past.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into one island and its 2 often conflicting realities.
And thank you, the listener, for sticking with us through this complex history and challenging present. We hope it's given you a clearer understanding.
We absolutely must give our sincere thanks for the incredibly detailed and insightful source material provided for this deep dive by Expert Trader UK. Their research was invaluable.
Hear, hear. Fantastic groundwork.
See you on the next one.
And maybe a final thought. The ultimate measure of a nation's stability might not be the strength of its walls, but perhaps the resilience of its bridges.